All right, let's go ahead and get started. And certainly, if folks join along the way, Tara will let them into the room. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leah Todd Lynn, and I'm with the nonprofit group Solutions Journalism Network. And I am so happy to welcome all of you and especially welcome James Causey, who is our guest speaker here today from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And I'll give just a short introduction and a little bit of context for today's conversation, and then we'll get right into James's presentation, which I'm really looking forward to hearing. So today's convener, this is part of the New England Equity Reporting Fellowship. So joining us today are members of the New England Equity Reporting Fellowship. This was a group overall of 76 journalists from all 6 New England states who last year applied and were selected to participate in a year-long fellowship to strengthen reporting on issues of race, gender, and identity here in our region. And this group represented 40 different news organizations from all across New England. So we want to welcome back, especially those of you who participated in the fellowship, and also welcome a couple of other select friends and other journalists from around the region and around the country who are joining us here today. So big welcome to everybody. And I want to do a quick introduction. So turn to the chat if you would, so we can get to know one another a little bit better. And if you would type in the chat your name, what news organization you are representing today, and where you're from. I think that'll help us get a sense of who's in the room. And also, please think about one thing that you love about your neighborhood, the place where you live. What's one thing that you love about your neighborhood? So please share those things in the chat. And while you are all getting going on that, I just want to do a quick shout out to the members of the planning committee for the New England Equity Reporting Fellowship and today's conversation. So shout out to Vanessa, who's here, Bijan Bain, Bob Green, Tara Cleary, Linda Conway, and Melanie Plenda. So it's been really a great experience working with this group over the past year to think about and convene these conversations. I'm really happy to be part of it. And also a big thanks to the New Hampshire Endowment for Health. Melina Hill-Walker and Karen Egger are here today, and their financial support is making today's conversation possible. So big thanks to them as well. Okay, so we have the bird song in your neighborhood. That's wonderful. Others, please chime in the chat. Corey is here from the New England News Collaborative. Welcome, Corey. How walkable your neighborhood is. Yeah, that can be a big plus. And no worries, we see you can stay till 12:40. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Dana. Yeah, proximity to hiking trails. Well, please keep introducing yourself in the chat, and I want to get us going on James's conversation. So I do want to turn it over to James. I will drop a link to James's bio in the chat so you can explore more of his several decades of reporting in Milwaukee. He is has a long career of reporting in Milwaukee. As a fellow Midwesterner, I went to college in Milwaukee, so I'm super proud to have spent time in the community where James is now reporting. And we are going to be recording this first session. So James's presentation will be recorded. And then we're going to stop the recording, have a couple of minutes of Q&A in the big group, and then turn it over to Vanessa, who will guide us in a couple of breakout sessions so that you can all continue the conversation and talk a little bit more specifically about how this is landing for you and for your work. So James, over to you. The mic is yours.
Okay. Hey, first of all, I just want to say it's a pleasure for me to talk to you about some of the projects that I worked on and how we all need to do a better job on building trust in the communities that we cover. I want to go over 4 main issues with you today. I want to give you some background on how we started building trust at my company. I want to tell you about some of the pitfalls we faced along the way and some successes. I want to discuss some of the ways your media organization could work at building trust in underserved communities. And I also want to highlight a few of my projects and leave you with some tips that could help you in the future. Does that sound like a plan? Okay, good. So building trust may be the most important thing we could do as journalists to save our jobs. We know trust is declining and people are less trustful of the news media. But media organizations are caught in this vicious vortex right now. We have more competition than we ever had before in ways that people take in their news. Our revenue streams have changed, so we're now more focused on digital subscribers. Our political identity is an issue where Republicans and Democrats have their loyalty in their own media sources. And there's just a lot of misinformation out there. Misinformation hurts all of us. A recent Pew Research Center study uh, posed a question to people and said, do you trust your local media organizations? And surprisingly, well, not surprisingly to us, a lot of people said no. But what people did connect to were reporters at organizations that they see. If you're interviewed by a reporter and they leave a positive experience with you, that's builds trust. If you see people who look like you portray positively by your media organization, that also builds trust. And if they see reporters and editors and communities like having Starbucks, shopping, attending a sporting event, or just being present, that also builds trust. All of these things matter when building trust. But we know that the pandemic set us back and media companies were not immune. So any gains that we made in building trust prior to the pandemic were lost. Think about it. We went from shelter in place to Zoom meetings to social distancing with masks. But I tell this to anyone, if you're still doing Zooms with people that you could meet in person, stop doing that. I mean, we have to get back to being reporters. And by being reporters, that means we have to get back to being visible. And so I'm going to tell you right now to cut out with the Zooms, even though we have to do a Zoom today, but uh, be visible and get out and see people. I often joke that I'm probably the most accessible reporter in the newsroom, and that leads to the successes I've had. I You can reach me by email, phone. My Facebook page is open, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and I'm always out and about. And sometimes when I go out in the community, say if I'm going to be working from a coffee shop one day, I may say, "Hey, I'm going to be at this coffee shop from 1 to 2. If you want to stop up and chat, I'm available." Those things build trust, so keep that in mind. Accessibility matters. Since 2019 to 2022, we lost 360 newspapers that have gone out of business, according to a Northwestern study. That means 360 plus communities lost a trusted media source. That essentially means that 70 million people, or a fifth of this country, are either living in an area with no local news organization or at risk of losing one. That means we're living in scary times right now. I know personally, since January, I lost my boss, David Haynes, who was the editorial page editor, and I lost my managing editor, George Stanley, who I worked with for more than 20 years. I mean, those types of relationships have really changed the dynamics of what we're dealing with. I now have a new boss who I'm getting to know. And, so we're always in these constant changes. But one thing that doesn't change is building trust. And that's one thing that we still need to constantly work on. 6 years prior to losing David Haynes to buyouts, right around 2017 or so, David Haynes and I started looking at ways of building trust in the newsroom. And this came at a time when Gannett, my parent company, said that we needed to grow our audiences with people of color. And I'm pretty sure some of you have heard the same thing. But we started to ask ourselves, like, are we connecting the community of color beyond our crime and poverty coverage? And that's a really serious question that we need to ask ourselves. We also wanted to know if we were doing, what are we doing to get more diverse stories and diverse voices into the paper? Where do people get their news from? And do they trust their information where they're getting their news from? And how can we get them to trust us again? So this started as like a two-man team with me and Dave leading the way, because I was a trusted source, so I was already out there, and Dave wanted to get to know how we could do things better. First slide, please. So Dave and I started our conversations by going into spaces frequented by people of color. We went to coffee shops, the libraries, senior centers, and we even had a booth Like in this picture, a booth at Juneteenth. And what we did was we displayed some of the artwork from our projects at this Juneteenth booth. And we asked those questions and we took a poll to see what people would tell us. And honestly, people were just honest with us. They told us our news coverage was too negative, and I'm pretty sure, let me know if you've heard these things too. They told us our coverage was too negative. The only time that they see us in our community is for like shootings and fatalities or something bad. They wanted to know what our diversity numbers look like in our newsroom because they didn't think we had enough people of color, which we don't. They asked, they wanted to see reporters telling more positive news stories. And honestly, some people just let us have it. They blasted us. They told us that they blamed us for a lot of problems that exist in the community today. So at some of these meetings, Dave Haynes, my boss, wanted to defend the works of the paper, saying, you know, well, we did have this story where we did this. And I remember tapping him on the shoulder and saying, no, let's just listen, you know, because sometimes you have to just listen. So if I leave you with anything today, remember this. When you go into the community that your media company has ignored for years or used a helicopter approach, just remember, try not to defend that right away, but just listen, because sometimes people just want to be heard. And defending the actions of what may have happened years and years ago, that's not really on you to do at that point in time. Also, what Dave and I did when we gathered this information, we went to leadership at our media organization and said, what are we going to do to respond to this? You know, are we going to hire more journalists of color? What are we going to do? Then after you get this information and you talk to your leadership, go back to the people and tell them what you found and listen some more, because we can't listen enough. And then promise to get them more involved at a future date, which we did. We held a event at right in the Central City Library, right in the heart of the city. And we invited like 60 to 80 people showed up. And we created like some charts of what people would want to see and the type of stories they would want to read. And what we ended up finding is like dozens of great stories that we didn't even know existed. And we started to report on those stories. And we even saw a little bump up in our online subscription based on that. As a journalist of color, I pride myself on being a Black journalist who's close to the action, who lives in the heart of the community. And me and my wife, who's on the call as well, we live right on 39th and Capitol Drive in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I know you guys may not know where that is, but it's like right in the middle of everything. So it has some advantages and disadvantages. Next slide, please. One of the advantages is that, and it was told to me by Byron Stevenson, the author of the book Just Mercy, and that's him in a photo with me. He said, you can't understand most of the most important things from a distance. You have to be close to them. So think about that as a journalist, what that really means, being close to something. It's hard to report on any issue if you just helicopter in and helicopter out. You have to be there. People see me in a community, so I get approached all the time with a lot of breaking news stories and things that we should know about. I'm also active in the community, and I would tell you to do some of the things that I do. Next slide. I MC at events. I moderate panels. This photo was me at a Project Return event for people re-entering society after they've been incarcerated. Next slide. This is me at moderating a panel at Alverno College. It's a women's college in Wisconsin, where we were talking about how you build a better Milwaukee. Next slide. And the day before I was at Alverno, I moderated a panel of credible messengers at the House of Corrections. It's a male prison in Franklin, Wisconsin, because guess what? Those people have voices too, and they need to be heard. So I would tell you to really get out there and as journalists, to build trust, people have to see us, and people have to see us in different capacities. The disadvantage of living in Milwaukee and living on 39th and Capitol is that I'm close to everything. So it's a blessing and a curse. I guess what I mean to say is that I never get a break from anything. And Milwaukee has a reputation of being a theft capital of the world, or a theft capital of the Midwest, I should say. And when our daughter got her car stolen when she was moving into her new place, I decided, even though she was suffering from that incident, I wrote a story about it because I wanted people to see that, hey, we're experiencing the same things that you're experiencing. And those types of stories resonate and they help build trust. Another drawback to being who I am, and that's a Black journalist, is that some of my colleagues expect me to know everything about everything Black, and and I have to often correct them that nobody knows everything about anybody, and that we're not a people where we all think the same. So that has its drawbacks as well. But one thing I would say is that I wouldn't trade my experiences for everything. Being close to the community has helped shape me as a reporter, a columnist, an editor, a projects reporter, and just a human being. I'm close to these things, and I could talk about them in an authoritative way because I'm close to them. And I realize some of you may not live in a central city and things like that. So you probably wonder, well, I don't live there, so how can I be close? Well, you could be close by trying out some different things that we tried in our newsroom that I think were pretty successful. While it will be ideal for every reporter to get into every community and get to know the people, we know that's impossible just based on timing and all the things that we have to do. But a couple of things that we did in our newsroom that I think will work for you, and some things you could consider, is like maybe a lunch and learn series where we invited beat reporters to come in, and they brought in people who experience a lot of the problems that we see exist, and a lot of the joys as well. For instance, Tori Lowe is a trusted community activist in Milwaukee, and he brought in women who had been evicted or facing evictions. I think it was roughly about 6 women, and it gave our reporters during this lunch and learn a chance to hear those people and see them, and it was tangible for them. We got some good stories out of that. We invited members of the LGBTQ plus community to come in and talk to us about their struggles. There was a gay police officer who gave her views, a man who runs a homeless shelter for teens, a Black trans rights activist who talked about the things that she faced on a daily basis. And we even had the new leader of this group called Diverse and Resilient, which caters to the LGBTQIA plus communities, come in and give his take on what he sees. We brought in people who were affected by reckless driving, where we not only had the victims of reckless driving, but we also had some of the young people who actually stole cars, and we put them like face to face so they could hear from each other and hear that pain. Those kind of things build trust, because where else can that happen? We partner with nonprofit organizations who have like the same agenda that we have to get a bigger bang for the buck. So think about this, like a lot of the big nonprofits, they may focus in on maybe housing issues, early childhood education, poverty. If you're working on a project that's dealing with this, why not partner with them and see if you could form some kind of collaboration to get a bigger bang for the buck and get more people out, and so they can understand and hear what's going on. We have also used some of our reporting to do in-depth embedded stories, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that focus on mental health, trauma, mass incarceration, jobs, education, and that not a racism that we just really can't ignore, but we need to talk about more. And one thing that we did, next slide, please. We made a public announcement on our webpage, which reads, "The success of we must reflect our audience to serve all the citizens of our city, state with relevant, trustworthy news." And that was written by my boss, George Stanley. That photo is, you can probably see me, it's a little grainy, and my wife is in the back in a massage chair, but we participated in this event where we had people come over to our house, diverse group of people, and talk about race and racism and how we could move past that. It was a great series that we partnered up with a nonprofit to do that, and other people all across the city did the same thing. While this may seem like small steps, they go a long ways towards accountability and building trust. Next slide. Lastly, I was mentioning this. I tend to do engagement events with every major project that I have. And one thing that I learned over time, a good way to build trust is make sure that the people that you reported on, that you bring them in and make them a part of your engagement process, your engagement event. Maybe they want to speak, maybe they want to be on a panel. Um, in this event, we held a storytellers event, and we gave people who wanted to a chance to talk about their life and what they were going through. The woman here who was very non-trustful of a lot of things in the media. She works for the Hunger Task Force. She shared her story on how she dealt with poverty and growing up poor most of her life. It's the first time she ever shared that story, and she shared it on stage, and it was eye-opening. It was very, very great. It was a great night. So think about those things. And I would even say this, when you do engagement events too, even go a step beyond. Host those events in the communities that you wrote about. Don't take them across town. Like, for instance, when I was working on a project in the 53206 zip code, some of my bosses wanted me to hold the engagement event at City Hall or a bigger venue that was very nice and expensive. I decided to hold the event at the Wisconsin Black Historical Society right in the heart of 53206, the neighborhood that I wrote about, so it make it easier for people to get there. Think how smart that was. It gave access to the people that I was writing about, and they invited people there. That builds trust because they knew I understood where they were coming from. So next, I want to move into some phases of talking about, my projects and how I learned trust, and how trust is something that even if you do everything right, you still get blamed. So first, I want to talk about my first project. What happened to us? Um, this was an opportunity for me to take a deep look at the role mass incarceration played on my third grade class in 1978. Next slide, please. So this photo is a photo of my third grade class. I'm right in the front row, right in the middle with the green suit and the red track shoe, because we were about to go out and play football right after this picture was taken. I'm holding a comb that all the boys used to comb their hair. Well, we tried to comb our hair right before the photo was taken, and a pencil because I always loved to write. I always wanted to be a writer. There's 28 kids in this class, and this is probably the most diverse class I've ever been in. My teacher was Miss Bakuza, who I loved my teacher. But this was a class of 1978. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to tell a story of mass incarceration through my third grade class in our lens. So let me give you a little history. Back in 1970, the New York Times came to Milwaukee, and they declared Milwaukee the best place to live if you were African American. And they based that on our booming manufacturing base that paid a livable wage to people like my parents who came to the Midwest from Mississippi. There was a lot of people coming, a lot of Blacks coming from the South to the North for jobs. This great migration took place over several decades. It allowed many Blacks to buy their first home, buy a house, get a really good job, get married, and raise their family. And in 1978, my parents bought their first house, just 3 blocks away from Samuel Clemens Elementary School. My father was a welder. My mother worked on the assembly line at Costco operation. And I moved from 53206, which was a neighborhood that was all Black and an all Black school, to a neighborhood where we had German neighbors on our right and racist white neighbors on our left. Uh, it, but the school that I went to, it was a good mix of kids. Um, Several things happened for this project to come together. In 2013, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee came out with a study that says Wisconsin had the highest incarceration rate in the nation for Black males in Milwaukee County. The study went on to show that think about this, half of the Black men in their 30s has served some time in a state prison. And so I wanted to find a different way to tell this story. And that's why I focus in on my third grade class, because I remember this urban legend that existed that a lot of people still talked about. And it basically said that prison cells and the number of prison beds is based on third grade reading scores in public schools. And I always remember hearing that. I didn't know if it was true or not. I would later find out that it wasn't true, but enough people believed it where they believed it was true. So that was one of the questions, and that's how I went into working on this project. So the original goal for me was to just reach some of the kids from the class and really tell their stories if they had been touched by incarceration. But I wanted to do it bigger. So I reached everybody from my class. I wanted to tell this bigger story. And what I discovered out of the 28 people from Miss Marilyn Spacuzza's class is that 13 out of the 28 had spent time in prison or had a close family member, parent, brother, sister, or a child locked up at some point in time. I would also discover that this was not just an incarceration project, but this was our project on trauma, housing, jobs, education, lost opportunity, fear, and mostly trust. This project was all about trust. I mean, I'm reaching out to 28 people who I haven't talked to or seen probably since sixth grade. Some of them were eager to talk to me. Some shared too much information. Some didn't want to talk to me at all. And some even relived some of the past traumas that they grew up with after they talked with me. Let me start with the good. Let's start with Corey Campbell. Now, on that picture, Corey Campbell is top row, third from the left. He has his eyes closed. He has on a brown shirt. You see Corey up there? Well, Corey Campbell and I were best friends in third grade. We played basketball together. He had a voice that was like a broadcaster voice because his parents were Jehovah's Witness, and he did a lot of talks and speeches. When I talked to Corey at first, he was thrilled to meet with me. And then after like talking to him like for a couple of times, he ghosted me for like 4 months, and I didn't know why. But this is what I learned about Corey. He graduated from high school in 1987. Corey wanted to go into manufacturing like his father did, but most of those jobs had dried up. He got a job working in a car dealership until it closed. He lived with his roommate, and his roommate lost his job. They were both on the brink of homelessness, and they came up with this brilliant idea to rob grocery stores, which didn't have security. They had 8 successful robberies, if you want to consider it successful. And the 9th robbery, Corey didn't participate. He stayed at home. He said, we got to stop doing this. We're going to get caught. Well, his roommate went out and robbed a grocery store, and the police followed him back to his apartment. And I never forget, Corey said that he was arrested at gunpoint and taken out of his home in his silk pajamas. Nearly 100 people came to support Corey during his sentencing, and he received 6.5 years, but he was released in 2 just based on his good behavior. And he was honestly a good guy. Corey said he ghosted me because he wasn't working, right? And he knew what kind of story I was trying to do and the story I was trying to tell. And he didn't want it to seem like he was dependent upon his wife. And he's a prideful guy. And I remember him say, brethren, I didn't want to talk to you until I had a job lined up. And then I knew I had something to say. And I thought about that. That's deep. And so when he talked to me, and I wrote my story up and talked about his pitfalls and how he overcame so much, I felt like I owed it to him to read him the story back. I read it back to him word for word. And I remember it was probably 11 o'clock at night. The story was going to come out probably in the next 2 days or so. And I never really read stories back to people, but Corey had never been interviewed by a reporter before. And I remember how quiet he got. And I was a little nervous. And then he said at the very end, he said, brethren, that was good, but I have one request. Can you just take my mother's name out of it? Because she's still a practicing Jehovah's Witness, and she still goes to people's houses, and I don't want to embarrass her. But other than that, brethren, that's really good. Thank you. And I felt so good. The trust that I built with Corey helped me reach other kids because he helped me find other people that I couldn't find because he vouched for me. He gave me the number to Yolanda Davis, who's the next person I want to talk about. Yolanda was always a little different. When I remember her being different in third grade, she was a little, I guess this term fast is what a lot of people like to, it's an old time term where she was pretty advanced. But I discovered that her mother died when she was 18 months old. She dropped out of high school her freshman year because she was pregnant by a gang member. She never really had a close relationship with her father, who had 11 kids, and she was raised by one of her father's girlfriends. And by the time she was 22, she had 4 kids. Addicted to cocaine from 1987. She even ended up on Wisconsin's most wanted list for drug dealing and spent time in a women's prison from 2003 to 2008 on federal heroin charges. Um, she gave me this quote, I'll never forget. She said, "Despite all the problems, my children have never been incarcerated. All my girls have graduated from high school, so I don't care about myself, but at least my girls are doing well." When I called Yolanda up and said, "Hey, Yolanda, I want to talk to you because I'm working on this prison project. I know you had some mishaps, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that, but it's a bigger project on what happened to everybody from our class." I said, "I could take you out to eat. We could go anywhere you want to go. Where would you like to go?" And she agreed to meet with me, and she said, "Let's go to Arby's." And I was like, "Arby's, that's interesting." Because when I was talking to other people from my class, they were picking really nice restaurants, right? And she picked Arby's, this fast food place. And we go there, we talk, we cried, we shared a lot of emotional stories. And I asked her, I said, "Why did you pick Arby's? We could have went anywhere." She said, "Because when I got out of Techeetah, Arby's was the first place to give me a job." Never forgot that. The trust that I built with her was amazing. But one thing I'll tell you this: when you're working with a certain group of people, sometimes they're very transient. They move around a lot. And so when I interviewed Yolanda, I knew she was going to be hard to keep up with. So I really wanted my editors to jump on this story right away, edit it so I could go back to her if I had any questions and stuff like that. But, my editors moved kind of slow and she had disappeared. And honestly, I haven't talked to Yolanda since. So I don't even know if she even enjoyed the story. And then there's a story of Desiree. I don't even want to say her last name. Um, in third grade, she was like the queen of all the girls. She was athletic, smart. Um, Everybody loved her. And she could fight. She could do it. Whatever she could, she was just amazing at almost everything she could do. And a lot of people respected her. Some I respected her out of fear because she had all these brothers too. She worked in retail before she enlisted in the Army in 1991, and she was discharged after a year. After she was discharged, she stayed in several homeless shelters. She got hooked on drugs, and she was even on drugs when she had her second son. The story I was going to do on Desiree was on housing because she was able, at the age of 48, to purchase her first home. She was the first one out of her brothers and sisters to do so. And even though she purchased her first home, there was this question. I was like, how did she pay for this? Where did you get your money from? Because she didn't really work. And she wouldn't tell me. And it was getting close to that deadline as to like, I had to get this question answered. So I remember pulling her to the side and said, "Desiree, I still really need to know how you pay for this $300,000 home." And she paused and she said that, "Honestly, James, I received a disability check from the Army because I was raped by my supervisor when I was locked up." And she said, "That's the first time I ever said that out loud. Most people don't know this." She trusted me to tell me that. And I said, "Can I use that in the story?" And she said, "Yes, it's my truth." So I put it in and I read it back to her like 2 days later. I even met with her in person and read it to her so she could really feel the full impact. And I gave her a copy of the story while I was sitting there so she could read it. And she cried and handed me the copy back and said, "I never had a story told like that on me before." This story was fantastic. It runs in the paper or it runs online. And 15 minutes after it runs, "What are you doing? You ruined my life. How could you put all of this in there?" Like, whoa, what are you talking about? I read it back to you, but she didn't know the impact it would have on her life. She relived all of the traumas that she went through from the time she was assaulted in the army, everything else, maybe her addictions, all of that stuff came up. I felt it in the gut of my stomach, and I still feel it today, even when I mention her name. I felt like I did something wrong, but I thought I did everything right. I didn't know what else I could have did. She came down to the paper. She talked to my boss. My boss defended me. She even went to the mayor's office, if you could believe that, like he could do something. I remember me and the mayor was close. He called me and said, "Hey, do you know this young lady? She was over here complaining about what you guys did in the paper." I said, "I don't have any control of that." But it impacted her. And I just want you guys to know that even sometimes when you do everything right, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You can't control how people will react, and it's nothing you could do. And I did the story on this young man named Gary who throughout high school, throughout school, he was very smart, very hands-on, went to a technical school, uh, wanted to go into manufacturing like his father did. His brother was in manufacturing, his whole family was in manufacturing. They had came up from Mississippi too. Those jobs dried up. He couldn't find work. He got in trouble with the law because he was stealing high-end cars in Chicago, chopping them up, selling the parts. Gary, after he served 3 years in prison for stealing cars and chopping them up, after he got out of prison, he applied for a number of manufacturing jobs. Nobody called him back. He finally get a call back from Harley Davidson. They bring him in. They love him. They put him on several apprenticeships. He receives like dozen apprenticeships, and he becomes a pillar in his community. He has a home, a family. He's coaching his daughter's basketball team. He has 2 kids in college. He's involved in his church and all these kind of things. And this story is going to lead to project, the Milwaukee's Promise, the What Happened to Us project. And Gary ghosted me during the fact checking. I tried to call him for 2 weeks, and then I get a call from his brother at work, and he says, "Hey James, you may not remember me, but I'm Gary Patter. I'm Gary's brother, and I've been trying to reach. He's scared of what you're going to write about him." I'm like, "Well, I haven't even talked to him. I just want to do the fact checking." And he said, "Well, there's a story behind it that he didn't tell you about. He got the job hired at Harley because he didn't mention that he was a felon, and he's worried that if you do this story, mention that he'll lose his job." And he said, "Other people have lost their jobs for lying like that." I said, "Well, I need to talk to Gary." I give Gary a call. He finally takes my call, and I tell him with the situation I'm in, that this story is going to lead to project. He tells me that, "Please, you can't do this story because I'll lose my job. I didn't realize how I talked to you, but I didn't realize the impact it would have." My bosses get involved. They want to run the story. I don't want to run the story. What do you do? Right? Do I, is our goal to cause harm, or is our goal to really tell good stories? I stood my ground and said I didn't want to ruin this man's life. He's never been interviewed by anybody before. I don't know what good it would have did to tell that story. So I ended up telling a shorter story. My bosses were extremely upset at me. The newsroom was, some of my people in the newsroom that knew about the situation were divided. Some said they wouldn't do it. Others said they would, but that'd be an interesting discussion for you guys. What would you do? I didn't do the story because I figured that what would it look like for me to come into somebody's life and ruin it? And I didn't want to be responsible for that. Then there's another project that I worked on where trust was cultivating a community. This project focused on how the community garden on the corner of 9th and Ring Street is helping young boys talk about the mental wellness and traumas that they face on a daily basis. The garden has a dozen 4 by 6 foot vegetable boxes where they produce zucchini, lettuce, eggplants, green beans, tomatoes, you name it, they produce it. And that food produced at this community garden goes to residents, and the kids and the boys that work in the garden can have it and take it home. This is going to be the 5th year that we got this program that's run by Andre Lee Ellis. Next slide. And what he does, he teaches these boys on a shoestring budget over the summer. The program is aimed at boys ages 12 to 17. They arrive each Saturday in the garden. They pick up trash in the neighborhood. And at the end of the day, they collect $20. He also teaches them gardening because his belief is you could get kids to put their hands in the soil, they'll take their hands off the guns. I love that slogan. Along the way, these boys receive support and guidance from male mentors uh, who who tend, next slide, please, who they could talk to about mentorship. And that's Andre right there. When it came down to trust, I first had to get Andre to trust me. He was very protective of the kids. He even turned down CNN and other national media organization who came in to try to do a story. And next slide. And Andre was mad at me because he figured I ignored him for a number of years when he first launched the project. And this picture here, you can see the anger coming through while I'm smiling big, and he's like got this frown on his face. But over time, he got to trust me. But I first want to give credit to my wife for helping to bridge the gap that we had by going to the garden to volunteer to deal with her own traumas that she's experienced. My wife went to volunteer at the garden after the credit union she was working at was robbed at gunpoint by a 14-year-old boy and a 19-year-old girl. Both of them had guns, and the boy had on skinny jeans and a hoodie. Next slide, please. That's Mia in the garden. And so before the summer would start, she went there to help some of the young boys and Andre prep the garden because my wife does a lot of gardening. This event gave my wife, after she was robbed, she had trauma based on dealing with skinny boys with hoodies. She feared them, and this isn't where she wanted to be as the mother of 4 girls. But this self-treatment was bold, and it helped her put her around boys who looked similar to the boys who robbed her at gunpoint. She talked to Andre, convinced him that I was a good guy. I went down there. I met with Andre several times. Sometimes I didn't even take out a notebook because I just listened. And you don't need to take out your notebook all the time. But sometimes I have my recorder going, but just in case it was something really good that I needed him to say. But put the notebook away and sometimes just listen. He vetted me, I vetted him. I told him what my vision would be. And he wanted to know one thing: was I just going to helicopter in and just do a story and leave if I was going to be there for the long haul? I said, man, this is a project. I'm going to be here every day of the summer. He said, I need you to be here more than on the Saturdays. I need you to come and get a flavor for the community. And I did. When I told him that I used to live just 2 blocks away from where his garden is, that helped cement some of the trust that I had established. I just had to decide how I was going to report on the story. Was it going to be a fly on the wall? Was it going to be involved with the boys? The first week I tried to be a fly on the wall, then it didn't work. I had to be involved. Next slide. So I would talk to the boys. I gave motivational speeches. I took them out when they were picking up trash, and I listened to them as they talked about some of the traumas that they were going through. After a shooting one weekend, one of the former mentors of the garden was killed, and his 5-year-old son was shot like 4 times. And one of the teen boys who I really got close to, I was working with, was grazed by a bullet. And the shooters were still at large. When we were out picking up trash in the neighborhood, that his grandmother told me, she said, Mr. Causey, make sure my grandson gets home safe because they have not caught these boys who killed his cousin. What level of trust is that? That's a higher level of trust. She trusted me with her grandson, and I took him home every Saturday from the garden in the car. Another incident of trust came midway in the summer when I took my parents, me and my wife took my parents to Mississippi, and the boys didn't think I was going to come back because I warned them I wasn't going to be there the following Saturday. It was like, you're not going to come back. Even Andre didn't believe I was going to come back. And when I did come back, you should have seen the smiles on their faces. Very big. I know we're getting short on time. I want to talk about one last project, and then I want to give you some tips. Next slide.
This is the last one in the deck.
Yes.
So
no, you don't have a picture of David Crowley? There should be another photo. Anyway, if you don't have it, it's fine. Anyway,
okay.
David Crowley is a Black man who became the first Black county executive of Milwaukee County. This guy had been evicted several times, and he never told his story, but he agreed to finally tell his story to me. And I told his story, and he opened up to me about how evictions changed his life, how his parents were addicted to crack. He even referred to his parents as crackheads. I remember Crowley, he just got so comfortable with me because I was always around him. And he mentioned to me that his parents' crack addiction, he was unaware of it until one of his friends said, "Do you know your parents are crackheads?" And he was like, "Man, I didn't even know that." Anyway, when I put that in the story, it's in a pit in my stomach. Like, I know he called his parents crackheads, but I don't think he really means to call them crackheads. And I remember going back to him and saying, "Hey, David, there's one thing that you said in the story that's bothering me. I just want to make sure you cool with this." And I read it back to him. He said, "Man, don't call my parents crackheads." He said, "I was just kind of telling you that." He said, "Can you just change it and just in a way that just you could say they were on drugs or something like that, but don't call them crackheads." He said they're both go to church now and they're both saved, and I don't want to diss them like that. And I fixed it. Since I did that, Crowley has been like one of my best friends. And so follow those pits in your stomach. So I know we're short on time, but here are some tips I want to leave you with to build trust. And there's like 9 tips. I will give you 10, but I like 9. First, listen and be present. Listen and be present. That's the key to everything. You have to listen and you have to be present. Number 2, keep your promise. If you say you're going to do something, do it. Like if I would have came back to the garden and even though that young boy didn't think I was going to come back and Andre didn't think I was going to come back, and I told him I would come back. Imagine if I didn't go back. Imagine how that would feel. Remember that some people have never been interviewed before, like Corey Campbell, when I read the story back to him. Explain to him what you're doing and what your purpose is. Because a lot of people don't know what we do. They don't understand our jobs. On project pieces, make sure you include resource pages at the end of your stories. Like, for example, if you're doing a project on evictions, make sure you include a list of resources for your online version so you could tell people how they could go get help. I mean, that builds trust and it shows that it makes you an expert. Consider doing an engagement event around a project to keep the conversation going. I always tell you to do people to do that. If you do an engagement event, make sure that the people that you focus on are involved in some way, shape, or form. Make sure that they're on a panel. Make sure that um, maybe they want to do a storytelling event where they want to share their story, but give them the space to share their information. Look for gaps in your media organization's coverage. For example, Pulitzer winner Ann Wolfe created the poverty beat in Mississippi because there wasn't a poverty reporter in the nation's poorest state. We all have gaps in our reporting. Look for those gaps. The 8th one, well, I believe I'm the best person to tell the stories that I worked on, and people trust me because I'm Black. I realize being Black only goes so far. If I wouldn't have broken trust with these people, they wouldn't care what color I was. And lastly, and always remember this, trust your gut. Ask yourself how you think the person would feel. Like that crackhead comment, if I felt it in the pit of my stomach and I just had to double check that. Trust your gut, especially when you're dealing with people um, that you're trying to build trust with. And that doesn't mean that you have to bend over backwards and all these other kind of things to help people. If they're wrong, and we need to report on those things too. But I will tell you this, it's important to trust your gut. And with that, I hope you got something out of it.
James, thank you so much. I so enjoy hearing your perspective every time we have a chance to talk, and I'm just so grateful that you spent some time with this group today. Karen has been summarizing your takeaways here in the chat, so make sure you take a look at that. Um, and just thanks for being here and speaking up to this group from a different part of the country that really has a lot to learn from what you're doing in Milwaukee. So there's a lot here and a lot that I think really is translatable into the everyday. So I appreciate, James, how you got real concrete and specific, and a lot of these tips that you have don't take a ton of time. So I think there are things that every reporter or editor in the room can be thinking of how to do this without having to, invest 6 months or have a long-term project. Though we might all dream of doing that and may be able to do some of that. There are also everyday things that you shared with us, James, that everyone here can start doing tomorrow that are really important. So we haven't had any questions come in through the chat. One more reminder that if you do have a question for James, type it in there. We'll collect those and make sure that we have a way to facilitate James to respond to those questions. But at this point, I want to hand it over to Vanessa de la Torre, who will take us into some small group breakouts to keep the conversation going.
Thank you so much, Leah. And of course, big thanks to James Causey for sharing your hard-earned knowledge and expertise with us, and really also including these really specific examples of community coverage and not just helicoptering in. And like Leah said, these are very actionable tips for us to really think about implementing within our own coverage day to day. My name is, like I said, Vanessa, executive editor of the New England News Collaborative, a regional hub of public media stations. And on behalf of the planning committee of the New England Equity Reporting Fellowship, we wanted to make this webinar even more interactive, because we think that looking at our own coverage at our own newsrooms is really necessary to bring to surface these types of steps that we can take to improve our journalism. And we all know that it's not enough for us to sort of sit passively, and file this information away. We heard from journalists across the region that you want to engage in more of these discussions. So what's going to happen next is we're going to have breakout groups for about 15 to 20 minutes, we'll see. But if you were a fellow in the New England Equity Reporting Fellowship, if you recall, doing the Maynard Institute Fault Lines training, you're welcome to join a breakout room for fellows. But we also have many other friends here, so anyone can join this other room that's being dubbed the Friends Room. So we're going to have basically two rooms, right? And we're going to pause the Zoom recording for these sessions. We want to give you that headspace to really share and think through these different elements that James has brought up. And we have some questions, just some prompts, to get the conversation going, including, what's important to you when you think about community coverage. And we're going to put the list of prompts in the chat. Do you have your own examples of where this coverage is done well? What are your biggest challenges in building trust among sources in the community? What barriers or obstacles do you face in the newsroom that you think are getting in the way of stronger community reporting? And what actions, you already heard some steps and tips from James, what actions do you think you and leadership can take to bring down these barriers and strengthen reporting on communities? Again, these are prompts. So if your group decides to take on one or two questions, great. We recommend you pick a note taker. And after the 15 or so minutes, 15, 20 minutes, we'll reconvene here with a bigger group and ask a rep from each group to share some top takeaways. And with that, I think we're going to break into these groups.
Can I say one more thing before you guys go? Don't be afraid of what you don't know. I think a lot of us, we get afraid and we try to play it safe. We have people who don't trust us, who are scared, who want to tell their stories. They want their stories out there. We can't be scared of these people. We have to get out there and share their stories because they're important to our community just like everyone else is. They may not have titles. They may not be the county executive or have titles, fancy titles behind their names, but they're citizens of our communities and they have very important stories to tell. So we have to quit being scared and tell those stories. And I know it may feel uneasy, but that's why we do what we do. So get into those spaces, find out what they're talking about, and share those stories.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. That's a perfect segue into
Thanks.
these. Right. See if, just quickly, I wanted to see if folks could share just a little bit, top headline of what your group discussed. And if you don't mind, Dana, I'll put you on the spot here, a quick summary of what we were talking about in the Friends breakout room.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we spent really a lot of the time just talking about how struck we were by James's presentation. We talked a little bit about that really difficult decision where you have to consider the value of the story you want to publish versus the effect it will have on the source. We also talked about just the importance of transparency with sources. But yeah, really just especially for me, and we talked about this obviously as a group, but just the third grade project is amazing, and really looking forward to finding that and reading it.
Thank you, Dana. Great summary. I wanted to see if anyone from the fellows group wanted to share some top takeaways.
I can share.
Thank you.
We talked about let's see, what did we talk about? Some of the challenges of representation in my newsroom and how that is a barrier to accessing communities, or just breaking down that barrier to communities. How important getting everyone in the newsroom to get out into the community is, even editors, especially editors. We talked about self-care, when you're covering traumatic stories, people with traumatic stories, how important it is to take care of yourself after you're covering something like that. Yeah, if anyone else wants to jump in.
Bijan, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Nice summary, Lily. I think you did a great job.
We had the best practices example of the gentleman that has the Congolese and African themed broadcast in Burlington, and that how that's a good example of a diversity outlet, and Lily actually covered it. And also we agreed that the third grade story was was a novel concept and very comprehensive.
Thank you, Bijan. Thank you, Lily. And big thanks again to James Causey for being our keynote presenter and sharing your expertise with us, so we can all continue to be better and push for progress. Because what we heard today, being present in our communities, not parachuting in, just for, a crime story, being visible, accessible, transparent, having diverse perspectives. These aren't, the nice to haves, right? This is something that we need to think about constantly. These are essential tenets of journalism that get down to the authenticity, accuracy, and fairness of our coverage. And we are stronger journalists, period, when we develop deeper connections with communities we cover. We tell more nuanced and accurate stories that ring true to these communities. So these are practices that are foundational to us getting the story right. And so I want to thank you again, James Causey. And before we wrap up, we want to let you know about another webinar we have coming up in September through the New England Equity Reporting Fellowship, which is funded, shout out to the Endowment for Health based in New Hampshire, with organizational support from the Solutions Journalism Network, the New England News Collaborative, NENPA, and the Granite State News Collaborative. We are pleased to welcome for that September webinar investigative reporter Philip Martin of GBH News. Philip, as many of you know, he's an award-winning journalist who has tackled some of the most sensitive stories in New England in recent years, including an investigation called Unseen on the sex trafficking of boys in a region. And right now he's also covering the rise of white supremacist neo-Nazi groups in our region. Philip Martin is a former Nieman Fellow like James Causey, and he was recently named among Boston's 100 most influential men of color. We're honored that Philip will be joining us to share his expertise on how he approaches these stories. We're nailing down the date of that webinar, but we'll keep you posted as we get closer to the fall. And once again, thank you for being part of this webinar, and thank you again to Mr. Causey. Hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, James.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.